across the fence, we're going to join a continuing education class at the University of Vermont. It's a class that starts inside, but the focus is outside. So we'll explore the woods along with students who are learning about wildlife tracking. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. On a previous program, we introduced you to a tracking expert from Jericho. At the time, we joined tracker and naturalist Mike Kessler as he worked with some middle school students on the basics of wildlife tracking. Kessler is also an instructor with UVM Continuing Education. Our Rebecca Gollin caught up with him again as Kessler revealed some of the keys to understanding wildlife tracking.
And one of the first things and most important things is when we go out tracking, we pretty much have to let go of our image of a track as being a perfect
One of the first things that Mike Kessler tells the students in his wildlife tracking class is to forget what they think tracks should look like.
Right now there'd be 1 out of 1,000 out in the woods that looks like that.
Which leads to the heart of what Kessler is imparting to his students.
If we're going to go out in the woods right now and track foxes, we need to be looking for something else, because the other 999 tracks don't look like this.
The title of the class is like a little misleading because it says wildlife tracking, and like, so people may think like you're just kind of gonna like follow them and see where they like walked, what they ate, where they pooped, but it's like much more in depth. You really understand like why they took that trail, like what caused them to do what they did.
This class ended up opening up like huge doors for what tracks are. I used to think tracks were only like the really blatant ones in the mud, and now we're seeing like compressions and pine needles and being like, oh, that's a bear track. So
Ashley Anderson is an environmental science major with a focus on conservation biology and biodiversity at the University of Vermont. Like many of the students here, Anderson is an avid hiker and was drawn to the class in hopes of gaining insight into what she sees in the woods and what she might be missing.
So here we go. I definitely disturbed it, didn't I?
You disturbed it.
It's that empty space between the tracks where all the force is propagated. And when we look between my tracks here, especially this big fellow right here, you see a fold in the sheet that goes from one track to the next, to the next, to the next. Yeah, see how I just turned that over? Yeah. So we've got a bit of acceleration with the toes. So it's almost like it's coming to, with that kind of step, going in this, look at, if we split the middle of the toes now, we said it was going this way, but in this step, if we split this foot in half, it's going right this way, where you are. And look what's in front of us. A little, if you stand up for a second.
Sort of run and jump over it?
Run and jump, yeah.
I have outdoor labs like 2 or 3 times a week, and so when I go out now, I see things completely differently than the rest of my class, and I'm constantly tracking now. It's just kind of like, it's only been 4 weeks and it's already like ingrained in you.
What makes tracking different from most subjects is that instead of just learning something new, students have to learn to use what they already know in a new way. Kessler begins each class by sending the students outside to sit with no instructions.
The first thing we try to do is rebalance. And so by rebalancing, we go sit with no purpose, to settle down. And then we start to look at the world through its entirety with our rods to rebalance. And then we start to use our left brain more.
we spend a lot of time at a sit spot getting to know the baseline, kind of engaging all of your senses, smelling what's around you, kind of getting wide angle vision and working on seeing the landscape as a baseline.
Establishing that baseline is important because that is where changes or disturbances to the landscape are identified.
First, you see the trail, then you kind of zoom in and look for maybe where there's different compressions in the trail. And then from there, we were looking for how animals would walk, kind of pretending you were the animal. And then walking as if you were that animal, seeing where the prints would land, and then just feeling for tracks. Once we even smelled for the fresh ground of tracks.
So, given that, where's the next track?
Is there one right in here?
There's, whoop, yeah, that's the process. Let's one leaf at a time. We've got the same tools within us that every other tracker had.
Engaging all of the senses is key in tracking, but it's a hard thing to teach. Kessler says that people are inclined to look at the world through a narrow lens, even though our eyes are equipped to see much more than that.
When we think about how our eyes are made, they're made to see a baseline through the rods in our eyes. And they're also made to tunnel in on a tiny disturbance. There is a science and there's an awful lot of physics that can be applied to it. And there is a forensic side to it.
The connection between tracking and science goes even further, to the very methodology of what Kessler does in the woods.
What I was told when I learned this was don't take it at face value, prove it right or prove it wrong yourself. And when you constantly do that, lead with your imagination or your intuition, that's fine. That's how great research is done. But hypothesize and put forward a credible way to prove it right or prove it wrong and go about it.
It's that intersection of science and nature that brings us back to the classroom, where Kessler is sharing some of the techniques that he uses in class.
And this is all about physics, Newtonian physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when I do this on the sheet, it's showing how the force propagates through the sheet. I can do the same thing out in the woods. And as a tracker, my goal is to understand how does that force propagate the same force in leaves, or pine needles, or snow, or gravel.
Heading into the woods, the students apply what they've learned, with plentiful results.
So what kinds of tracks have you seen?
All kinds. I mean, the first day we looked at bears, deer. Today I found mink, raccoon, otter. We saw a heron track. Like anything you could possibly think to find in the Vermont woods, like we've seen.
This new way of seeing the woods is knowledge that these students will use for a lifetime.
It really opens your eyes to the woods. You start seeing tracks everywhere, even on campus or in the city. So you start seeing like, oh, cat tracks, and like, oh, there's some dog tracks, there's people tracks, oh, there's people walked over people tracks. And so it's not just in the woods with bobcats and bears.
Once like you start becoming aware of it and you start like looking for it, it kind of just like turns a switch on and everything just kind of falls into place and you just start doing it without even noticing.
Learning to engage their senses in order to more deeply connect with the world around them. These UVM students are ready to take a hike. In Jericho, I'm Rebecca Gollin with Across the Fence.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. Joining me now is tracking instructor Mike Kessler. Thanks so much for being with us again.
Oh, you're welcome, Judy.
Now, I want to follow up on a few things in the video. You said that only about 1 in 1,000 tracks actually is that perfect track. What do all the other ones look like?
Well, that's the big question. And even though like we were talking about tracking foxes, whenever an animal steps on the ground, they don't always make an indent, but they always make a compression. They do compress the ground. So we need to think of the ground as kind of like a mattress. The bottom layer is the box spring, that hard surface where you can get a nice indentation, but above that is a softer mattress. And in the forest, typically it's layers of leaves, pine needles, cones, twigs, any of that fluffy stuff which we do compress. So I brought with me a poster of some tracks. So basically these are the shapes of the animal's feet. And each shape imparts a different compression in the ground. So what we do is go about looking for...
so these would be like the 1 out of 1,000 that you would see that
right.
you could easily identify.
Yeah, and the irony is that if they're walking on leaves, sometimes underneath the leaves is the perfect imprint of their foot.
Oh, no kidding.
So that's how we can continue to think we're on the trail, but every now and then stop, and as one of the students was doing, picking apart the leaves to confirm if we still are on the same animal going in the same direction. So that's kind of the real excitement about it, because where you can't see this from above, you can see it from below.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about baseline landscape. You have your students sort of settle and get the baseline, and what does that mean, and how hard is that to do?
Well, it's pretty easy. Like they were saying, it's sort of like a switch. In order to see a disturbance to a baseline, which a track is a disturbance, first we need to see the baseline. So this time of year, the best example is snow. And snow represents one of the 2 main characteristics, which is height. It makes the undulations of the landscape more even. So if anybody walks on it, it's very obvious. The other major component of a baseline is the composition. So pine needles, when they fall in a very random order. But when an animal, or even we walk on them, say barefoot, our toes poke through the pine needles, separate them, and they bunch up between our toes, so we create openings or spaces. And so where there was a consistent randomness to the baseline, we disturbed it and made patterns. So we would follow those patterns.
Interesting. You know, we heard one of the students say it is like a switch that goes on. Is this something that we can all do, but we've just gotten so far away from it that we don't recognize it, but once we learn it again, it's completely natural?
Yes. Yeah, it is totally natural.
That's wild. So you brought an image too that helps us understand what you mean by forces propagating on the landscape.
Okay. This is, I brought a jar of sand here.
Okay.
So this is something people could do at home by taking a simple jar, filling it with sand or salt, or even rice, but rice would simulate more like gravel. And take your finger or pencil and just poke down through the middle. The first thing I do is shake it so that this is our baseline and it's uniform, and I just touch it very lightly. And what I do is I ask students to do that and then just look at the entire surface of the sand and watch how it moves when the pencil first touches the sand or your finger. And they find that the area of movement is several times wider than the diameter of the foot, or in this case, the pencil. So it opens their eyes to really, in a believable way, that these forces are propagating on the landscape. Two other ways that it can be done, but this is the easiest, is when you're walking on the beach where the waves lap up on the beach and the sand is damp, watch what happens around your feet where you step and it pushes water out. You have this like flash of light all around your foot.
Right.
Yeah. And one other way was just if you find a puddle in the woods, just jump up and down next to it. And I had a class do this about 30 feet from it. And in a split second later, you could see the ripples run through the puddle. It works best in springtime when you can see a perfect reflection of, say, the trees in the puddle. And then you see the water, the vibration of just our step or a jump ripple through.
So when you're looking for tracks, you don't necessarily look for little exact tracks. You look for where there are bigger compressions, because underneath that is probably where the track is.
Right, exactly. So we look at the things that are bigger and we go right to the middle. We tunnel onto the middle and that's where we look, because that's the source of that force that's propagating.
So before maybe taking your course or learning about this, you would look in the woods and just see these compressions, but just think that they were, I don't know, natural compressions. But then once you think, wait a second, the whole thing is going that way.
Right, you see a pattern of compressions and of certain shapes and sizes, and it catches your eye.
And how do you teach a student to find a track?
Okay, I brought some images here, and the first thing is basically how to see a needle in a haystack. So it's a reorientation of how we do that. There's our eyes have rods and cones built into them, and I brought a picture which is a graphical distribution of where the rods in our eyes are in our cones. And so instead of looking for a needle in a haystack by looking for, say if this was the needle amongst all the hay, it would be better if we could, say, spread out the haystack, step way back from it, and look at it in its entirety on a sunny day. And that little shiny needle somewhere will pop, it will reflect light, and that's how we could find it. So our eyes are really made to do that. We have rods that are clustered in the sides of our eyes, and then we have cones which are right in the middle for seeing fine detail. So it's just simply a matter of reversing the way we typically look for things. So instead of tunneling in to find something, we tunnel out. And that's what Ashley was mentioning on the program, that wide angle to our vision. And by doing so, our ability to just find what we're looking for is rather natural. The cones in our eye will find it, pick it out. Interesting.
Now, do you encourage people to sort of take steps left and right to kind of look at the same area just from a different perspective?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the metaphors we use in class is to, we have students look at a track from different opposite sides and they see different things. And then they switch sides and they see a whole new aspect of the track, which is a great metaphor for life in general, seeing both sides.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what about the part about smelling the ground for a fresh track? I mean, you're not actually smelling for an animal.
Well,
some animals probably smell more than others.
We're not smelling for the animal scent, but in that case, what happened was a bobcat had been jumped out of where it was lying down, and it went over a large branch, and the students correctly hypothesized that it landed on this rotten tree trunk, or not landed on it, but just hopped off it. And it had, but they couldn't find the track because they weren't sure what to look for. So what I had them do was go on the opposite side of the trunk and just scratch it open with their fingernail. and it smelled different there. And then I had them come around the other side and smell the tree trunk, and they smelled a place that was exactly like we freshly scratched, because this happened probably that night before. And it's much like a loaf of bread that comes out of the oven. It forms a crust, but if you cut it open, you can smell it again. So the earth is very much like that. So yeah, it's just one way of using another sense.
Mike, thanks a lot for joining us today.
You're welcome.
You can learn more about Mike's Introduction to Wildlife Tracking courses by contacting UVM Continuing Education. The website is learn.uvm.edu. Or you can call the Continuing Ed office toll-free at 1-800-639-3210. That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.